Welcome to the Myofascial Health Podcast, hosted by me, Unu. Follow along as I explore the depths of John Barnes' myofascial release approach on my road to mastery. Along the way, I'll be sharing the lessons I learn as I open my myofascial release practice in Austin, Texas, so that you don't have to make the same mistakes I do. Welcome back to the Myofascial Health Podcast. Now, I am joined here by a very special guest. She has had affiliations with different universities, spanning from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, Boston University, and the University of Miami. Shout out to you. It is my honor to welcome Carol M. Davis to the show. Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast.
It's my pleasure.
Now, you have been around the MFR circles for quite some time now. You know, I think I've met you in passing at a seminar, but I very much know that you're very integrated not only in this community, but you play a very pivotal role as extending the olive branch to the medical community. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to know, how did you even get into myofascial release in the first place?
Well, I think I first heard about it in a publication that was going around called Every Inch and a Half in the 80s. It was a newspaper type thing, and John Barnes had a column in it. And it was sponsored by the people who did the elastic stockings. And, you know, they had tape measures. Every inch and a half was referring to the tape measure, the way you fit somebody for elastic stockings. And they put out this little newsletter. It was before computers, it was before email, it was before mass. The only way of communicating with the masses was newspaper and television news, but there were no such thing as podcasts or anything like that. So John started writing this column on what he was teaching, myofascial release. It was like stirring a hornet's nest in physical therapy, because he pushed the boundary, the limits of acceptable belief in physical therapy that was very much patterned after medical science. And he was denigrated widely and scoffed and laughed at quite a bit. I just read it with some interest, but I didn't scoff at it at all. I was interested. I was curious. What is this guy talking about? And one of the other faculty at the University of Miami at the time in the 80s said, "Have you heard about this Barnes fellow?" And I said, "Yeah, I've been reading a little bit about what he's talking about." He said, "Well, he's here in Miami or in Fort Lauderdale. Why don't you go check him out and see what you think?" So I thought, why not? Sure. So I signed up for MFR 1, and I didn't know at the time that that was going to change my whole life. Now, if you're on MFR Insight, you'll read many, many times people will say that. I had no idea that taking this course was going to change my whole life, but it is, and it was for me, a very life-changing moment. I took the course, and I felt for the first time, I had lots of questions about my practice. I was practicing much more holistically than physical therapy recommended. I wasn't thinking of the body as a machine. I was thinking in spiral diagonal patterns. I was doing PNF. I wasn't doing cardinal plane exercise. I was doing functional activity, mat exercises, the developmental sequence that PNF teaches. I studied with Dorothy Voss in Chicago, and one of the teachers of PNF. And I taught PNF, and I taught nervous system, neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, because that was where what my master's degree was in, neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. And PNF made great sense to me. And then there I was with John Barnes, experiencing this different approach to people. And I felt for the first time the cranial rhythm, what we thought at the time was the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid around the dura and up around the cranium. And we now know it's more than that, that all cells reflect this in and out from the cosmos, and that whole body itself is reflecting this dynamic push-pull energy that we now know as biotensegrity. And I thought, wow, this blows my mind. And I felt the connection with my patient, the person that I was working with, in a way that I had yearned for. I'd yearned for an explanation of what I was feeling with my patients. But I got scared, like many do, many physical therapists, when they're confronted with such a big shift in our understanding of science. And yet I was very, very curious. And I knew eventually this is what I would practice. But I was steeped in the culture of physical therapy. I was on the editorial board of the journal. I did quite a bit of teaching nationally for physical therapy. And I recognized that when I embrace fully this way of treating patients and this approach and this methodology and these principles that are based on a science that we didn't understand, I would be subject to the same kind of criticism. So in 1993, I started reading more. And I didn't take any more courses, but I kept reading. And and many people know that I'm an identical twin. And so I was trying in my reading to recognize what science had to say about this energetic connection that I felt with my sister that was across no boundaries. I mean, she was in Wisconsin and I was in Birmingham, and she got pregnant with her first child, and both of us stopped being able to drink coffee at the same time without knowing that she was pregnant. And we bought the same coat on the same day in two different cities. She was in Rochester, New York, and I was in Cleveland, Ohio at school. So this was starting to open my mind to think in terms of this must be quantum physics, because there's nothing Newtonian about this. And so I started reading, and I came upon some things that made sense to me from the quantum way. It was very hard for me to understand quantum physics. It's not an easy read, but I found some interviews. Michael Toms did some interviews with scientists. And in the interview process, very much like you and I are talking now, he would talk with people. And he has this wonderful interview with David Bohm, a physicist, who talked about the explicate and the implicate order. And I could understand physics, quantum in that model, using that analogy. And then he talked to Krishnamurti, and he talked to different scholars. And I took a leave of absence from the university in 1993, and I went to Arizona, to Sedona, because I heard the energy there is really very powerful.
It is.
I had never been there. And so I took 3 months, and I took my books and I house sat for somebody, and I was reading, and I had kept kind of tangentially in touch with John through, I don't know what mechanism we were using, because I wasn't using email by then, but I wanted to talk with him. I wanted to get his perspective on something. So I called Malvern, or Paoli at the time. I said, I'd like to talk to John Barnes. And they said, well, he's not here. He's in Arizona. And I said, oh, really? I'm in Arizona too. They said, yeah, he's in Sedona. And I said, I'm in Sedona. So they gave me his phone number, and I called him and I said, John, could we get together and talk about what I'm reading? And he said, sure. He said, you know that old artist shack out on 89A? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, meet me there on I think it was the 3rd of July or the 4th of July. This is 1991. No, 1993. 1993. Meet me there, and we'll talk. So at 1:00. So I parked there, and it was an old shack. There were a couple of cars there, so I knew somebody was around. But I looked around, I couldn't see anywhere, and I looked over the edge down into the Oak Creek, and there he was, sitting on a rock, on that big rock that's out in front of the treatment center in Oak Creek. And so I made my way down the cliff, and there were about 3 bathing beauties there with him. And I climbed up on the rock, and we had a conversation. And he said, I'm going to turn this into my treatment center. And what are you going to do to move healthcare forward in the next century? And I said, well, I'd like to write a book about the new science, how subtle energy impacts our bodies and healthcare. But I'm very reluctant. He said, why? And I said, well, I'll be ostracized from my profession, my culture. And he said, Carol, if you're worried about what other people think about you, you're going to have a very, very unhappy life. And so he said, you write that book and I'll open this treatment center, and we'll both be part of this forward movement. And sure enough, his treatment center, I think, opened in 1995 or 96. My book came out in 96 in the first edition. It's now in the fourth edition.
I got the book.
There you go. Integrative Therapies and Rehabilitation. Yep.
Yeah.
And I'm now working on the fifth edition with the publisher. So he wrote the chapter on myofascial release, and there are several other chapters. I wrote the chapters on science and how the science has evolved. And next Saturday, I'm going to give a talk about how on soft touch and why soft touch is so important at the British Fascia Symposium. And I'm going to talk about my journey of discovery, of finding John Barnes, learning his principles, and then discovering every step along the way. What were the moments, the aha, oh, this is why that principle that John teaches works. And of course, strolling under the skin was one of them. Gerald Pollack's crystalline water was one. My mechanotransduction, explaining thixotropy and piezoelectric effect, was one. All of these scientific discoveries that I found after I found that this soft touch brought about change with my patients in ways that science couldn't explain, or that I couldn't explain in a way that was scientific in nature. So I just kept at it. I kept reading, and here we are today.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Thank you for sharing that. To have John Barnes as your accountability buddy and him creating therapy on the rocks before anything was there, and you now having the fourth edition of your book working on the fifth is just such a great moment in time. And to see what has flourished when you don't care about what other people think about you or other people's judgments, even myself, I think I struggle with that sometimes. John has even called me out in the middle of a seminar saying, hey, you care too much about what other people think. And even though it kind of hurts to feel in the moment because you're just like kind of embarrassed in front of a group, it is true, and it's once you let go of that you actually find that freedom, that the channel 3 that we talk about. Now let's unpack some of your journey, because you shared a bunch of different things. But I just want to make sure that my audience can follow along, because you're a physical therapist and I'm a physical therapist. And so I understand what you're saying, but I think the common person, especially if you're not a physical therapist, can kind of get lost in some of the jargon. So you had talked about, before you even getting into myofascial release, that you were doing PNF. And PNF stands for proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. And it's like the diagonals of the body. It has to do with reflexes and how we develop.
That's right.
And you talked about that as saying, hey, I didn't do the cardinal directions that people were working out in. I was kind of using the neurological development to help rehab my patients from that perspective. And I love that.
Yeah.
But then you got into taking MFR 1 and you felt something different.
Yeah.
And then you didn't take another course for how many years?
5.
Another 5 years. So you took a course and you knew that there was something to it, right? Was it taught by John or was it taught by somebody else at that time?
It was taught by John.
Okay, so you got to learn from John and you got to feel what that energy felt like. What was your reservation of taking more courses?
Well, I knew that I was going to do a deep dive into the science, because people would come at me for degrading the profession scientifically, diluting the scientific foundation of physical therapy by prescribing woo-woo instead of scientific principles as prescribed by medicine. And I wanted to be able to come back to their criticism with, this is the science that I'm following. And of course, I moved from randomized trials, which is a false mechanism for understanding human science. It's a house of cards. It doesn't stand. It's based on materialistic objectivism. There's nothing materialistic objective about people at all.
Could you unpack that? What does that mean? And can you explain that to me like on 5?
Okay. When we want to find out if something is true or not, we want to find out the facts of it. We want to find out if, and so we go to science. We state a hypothesis, and then we say, and then we use our curiosity to figure out if that hypothesis is true. So basically, the way science is looked at with human beings and in healthcare, we look at whether the experimental variable, that which we're testing, can be applied to somebody as as a unique variable. All other variables are controlled for. And we apply that treatment to one person. And then we look to see what difference there is at the end. We measure the difference. We do a pre-test and a post-test. Now, ideally, if it's very, very good science, according to the hierarchy of excellence in research, a lot of people would have been subjected to this treatment, and no other variables would interfere with the experimental variable. And then there would be a control group where another group of people that were matched to the people that got the experiment were tested and pre and post tested to see if they had any change too, or was the change that we saw in the experimental group simply due to the treatment that we gave. And then we can say if it's a 50% or better response of those people positively changed after that experiment, then we say, oh, that's a very good treatment. And we're going to follow that treatment because a lot of people showed a benefit from what we did. Well, the foundation for following through on that scientific process starts out with the premise that everybody is essentially the same. Every person we try to control to make sure that everyone is within a certain age limit, that every treatment is exactly the same because we don't want that to be a variable. We want every treatment to be given over a period of time in the same way by ideally the same person or people who are doing the exact same thing, and that the person that's being treated is the same person every time they're receiving the treatment. Well, that's impossible. First of all, no person is going to be the same from one hour to the next. And so it's based on scientific objectivity. John loves to work out that word, objectivity. There's nothing objective about the human experience. We are all subjective. And then it doesn't take into account that quantum science shows very, very clearly that your attention to changing this person in this way is going to affect the change. That you can't be involved in the process of change without affecting that change itself through your attention and your intention. So that's the quantum part of it. So we go to science in physical therapy. We say, well, what do we do for non-specific low back pain? What's for people who are 65 and older? So we go to the journal and we say, what does studies say about the best treatment for non-specific low back pain for patients 65 and over? And then we'll get peer-reviewed journal articles about what physical therapists did and what their outcomes were based on Sackett's golden rule of did you have a control group? Did you control your variables? Did you tell exactly what you did in your process? Did you do the same thing? Was the reliability? Did you do the same thing every time in every way? And was the validity secure? Reliability and validity, all based on the idea that people can be the same moment to moment to moment, and they're not going to be affected by anything other than the treatment that you're giving. It's ludicrous. It's great for pharmaceuticals, perhaps, in a petri dish, but it is not great at all for human beings. In fact, the way we study human beings, we study the anatomy of human beings on color, two-dimensional photographs of cadavers. And as John says, you can't study life by studying dead people. And these two-dimensional pictures of dead people, of one dead person in one moment, is supposed to tell us everything we need to know about where the ulnar nerve is and where the vagus nerve goes. And how we should be studying human beings is to really recognize that three-dimensional photography that's available to us and the Wi-Fi holographic material that's available to us. We should be looking in an anatomy lab. The anatomy lab should have many, many human beings in holographic representation in front of us, and we're watching them move, comparing 2 or 3 or 4 humans moving, watching what the biceps does, and then we'd recognize right away there are no levers, because when we can watch them in life in hologram, instead of going to solid state physics on a two-dimensional picture in a book. That's not it. This is it. This hologram of this person moving. And then you'd see the muscles tensioning, and you'd see the flow of action from the muscle out to the ligaments. And then you'd see the closed kinematic chain down to the tendon. And then you'd see the ligaments and the tendon moving the forearm in a way that there's no pivot there. That's the 4-bar kinematic chain. And in response to external forces, in responses wanting to grab something, in response to wanting to move forward, to gravity. That's studying human anatomy and physiology. Well, and everybody's different. And you say, oh, look how that person did it. Now look how they're doing it two different ways. What can we find in these two people that are alike? Why is it different? Does that person's height have anything to do? Does that person's race have anything? Does that person's gender have anything to do with it? I don't think so. Human is human. And when you're looking on the inside of a human and you're looking to how we're responding to external forces, gravity and other forces, mostly gravity, but also electromagnetism and strong and weak nuclear forces, we're responding in real time. That's what we should be studying. So we are in the dark ages, as John says, and we learned a false science. And he's pretty bitter about it.
I couldn't tell.
He intuited these things, and then science caught up with him. And that's what, well, James Oshman in Energy Medicine, The Scientific Basis, described it first. And John went to this book, and I did too, to look for the energy. And then this book talks about how they put it all together. In the science part of this, puts the discoveries that science came up with that proved that Barnes' intuition of pressure and elongation, exactly what is needed to bring about a change in the ground substance, the extracellular matrix, which is crystalline, which we didn't know at the time, which it acts like a crystal. And then along came Pollock, and along came Stanley, and along came Gimbarteau, and along came Ingber, and along came all these wonderful scientists that I'm going to talk about at the British Fascist Symposium. And we said, that's it. That's why it works. That's why it is. And a wonderful moment was in 2012. Richard Hardy from California and I were there in Vancouver. And Pollock got up and talked about crystalline water. And I said, I had a question. He was talking about easy water and the H3O2, H2O becoming H3O2. And I got up and I said, Dr. Pollock, we who follow Barnes press down into the tissue, and then we wait. And what we feel is like butter melting. And then with an elongation, we feel like taffy stretching. Is that an accurate representation of physiologically of what's happening in the water substance of the extracellular matrix? And he said, that's exactly right.
Love it.
Richard Hardy and I were right. This was right. And then Paul Stanley gets up and says, let's take a look at these Petri dish studies. And he said, we're looking at cytokines. We're looking at little messenger molecules being released with pressure and elongation on the fascia, on the myofibrils. And what are we finding here? Well, at 2 minutes, not much is happening. In 3 minutes, in 3 minutes, all of a sudden the interleukins start to build and build and build. And so we get interleukin 8, interleukin 3, and interleukin 1A peaking at 5 minutes. That sustained part of pressure and elongation.
And that's one of the things that really differentiates John Barnes' myofascial release from every other hands-on treatment. It's that sustained pressure. And you so beautifully stated how there are certain things that get released after holding it for 3 to specifically 5 minutes.
Or longer.
And it's those natural anti-inflammatories that gets released through the pressure electricity. So, and that was a mic drop. So it's so cool for you to be able to be at a chapter in your life where you can say, hey, this is what I firmly believe and stand for, without the fear of judgment of, oh, but how are my peers going to think about what I'm doing? Because they're going to think it's pseudoscience or woo-woo. And there's always going to be
not reading the same science as we are. That's
correct. And I would say you just did a mic drop. I think for you to be able to say, hey, the way that we research medicine and study humans is all backwards. And
Mm.
if that's the paradigm in which we use as our golden standard,
Yeah.
then everything we build off of that is going to be wrong. I think most research is done on one, dead people, and then it's done on dead people who are laying on a table. So we identify, oh, this is anterior, this is posterior, this is the
Yeah.
anatomical position.
You're right.
But in real life, you're standing upright. You're having to deal with gravity, mass and momentum, ground reaction forces. And once you look at the body through that lens, you
Yeah.
realize that most of what we learned in the research, healthcare research, is totally false. I think a very simple explanation that I can think of is, simply what are the functions of muscles? And I had gone through a fellowship program through the Gray Institute, taught by Gary Gray and Dave
Wonderful.
Taberio.
Yeah, of course.
And
Yeah.
and they were the first people to teach me about fascia. Now, obviously, John looks at fascia through a different lens, but it was this whole idea of like, oh wow, there's this stuff that connects everything under the skin, and when the foot hits the ground, everything changes because of the chain reaction that starts up the chain,
Right.
right? Or if you use, you're going to reach for something. Well, how does that impact the movement then?
Right.
So I love how you stated that. And I would recommend, if you guys are interested in more functional, whether it be performance exercises, there's a lot of, athletic trainers or people in athletics, or people like me who are physical therapists. And you don't have to work with athletes, but it's this idea of like, hey, most of our lives are in upright function. Why is it that we're learning all these things based on dead people laying on a table? And
Yeah.
so there's really outdated modalities like neck traction machine. It's like I have so many patients, or I've heard patients who will lay down, get this traction, and they feel, okay, there's some relief that I'm getting from this because it's obviously pulling my neck apart. But like John used to say, PT used to be parking lot therapy, where once you get up off the table and you go back to your car in the parking lot, your symptoms return because guess what? Gravity is reintroduced into your system, and that is going to compress. So why don't we look and observe and study the human body as it functions upright, how we would normally do things, and then use that as a basis of, okay, let's understand human movement. Even the influence that you had stated, there's a connection between the therapist and the patient or the client. Those little subtle things that you cannot measure play such a profound effect on the experience that the patient goes through. Can you elaborate more on that? I know that you had talked about what is empathy and can empathy be taught? And
Yeah.
you intuitively knew that there was a connection between people. You talked about your identical sister having these moments of synchronicity that even when you guys are in different states, different cities, that you guys will somehow wear the same clothes or stop craving the same things. And that's just automatic. I think that I read a study that said most identical twins, when they live together, because they are together, they will try so hard to be different. But if they're in different locations, then without them trying to fight that difference and try to be individual, a lot of things will mirror. But can you kind of share your experience on the connection between therapist and patient, and then your research on empathy?
Yes. John believes, and I'm still working on the science on this, but I believe it too. He teaches that you place your hands, soft hands, in clay and go down to where you feel the person pushing back to meet the person. And you meet the person and you let your hands settle in and you take a breath. And then without sliding on the skin, you separate your hands in what he teaches the cross hands release. And then you come to a dead halt and you wait there. And as you're waiting there, you'll feel your hands start to sink in and start to move, reflecting the subtle movement of fascia as it unwinds underneath your hands. That movement of being pulled in, he talks about resonance. Resonance is a term in physics where waveforms, and they usually talk about vertical waveforms rather than horizontal, but vertical waveforms, when they come into connection with each other, come into resonance, and the waveform of one enhances the waveform of the other. And he feels that's when the real release starts. That's when fascia really starts responding to this external impact. When you're in a room with two musical instruments, let's say a piano and a cello, if you strike a chord on the piano loud enough so that the sound wave is in the room, the cello chord, the string, will resonate with that chord across the room. This is just simple physics. If you believe, as I do, that there is an energy outside of us that Irvin Laszlo calls the Akashic field, others call it the 0 point field, the quantum physicists call it the quantum plenum, that energy that's outside that all other energies are fueled by. It comes from the idea of the Big Bang and forms all of the stars and all of the planets and so forth. That energy outside of us is available to us and comes through us through these waves. Now, there's question about how it actually comes through the electromagnetic field around us into the body. Valerie Hunt, in her book, said that these waves come in and fascia acts as a kind of a filter, like a filament in a light bulb. It slows the electrons down so that they heat up and the light comes into the incandescent bulb. Our fascia slows the information out there. Everything that's ever been thought or spoken energetically is information out in that field, is the theory. It's called the collective unconscious by Carl Jung. It's called the morphogenic resonance by Rupert Sheldrake. That information is available to us. It might be the way that two researchers can come up with the answer to a very sticky problem at the same time and receive the Nobel Prize as the two founders of the HIV virus that causes AIDS, one at the Pasteur Institute and one at the CDC in Atlanta. They both came up with the retrovirus at the same time. And there was some squabble about who's going to get credit for publishing this paper. Two researchers just 2 years ago came up with the realization that under the epidermis are Schwann cells, fascial cells, connective tissue cells that act like neurons. They're ion channels, channeling pressure and touch down to the interoceptors, the C fibers, down in the fascia, which then go up the spinothalamic tract and then go over into the insula, so that they're actually fascial cells that are acting like neurons. But both of these men came up with this theory, and I don't know whether they were working together in the same lab, but they were both given the Nobel Prize for the piezo receptors under the skin. Well, John's been teaching about piezo receptors for as long as I've known him. And James Oshman in energy medicine talks about the piezoelectric effect. Resonance is between the therapist and the patient is a little bit harder to identify, but there was a study. This is a study by Saratelli, effect of continuous touch on brain functional connectivity is
modified by the operators.
Tactile, I'm reading it backwards, tactile attention. This is a study that looked at functional MRI of the insula, which is the center of the brain that is responding to the autonomic nervous system sympathetic parasympathetic message. There's the anterior, middle, and posterior insula that is telling us, is giving us information from the interoceptors in our bodies, 3 times as many interoceptors as there are proprioceptors. It's information in the interoceptors about how we feel and how we feel about how we feel. So it's somatic feeling and then emotional connection. We can feel very cold, and then we can feel anxious because we're cold, or we can feel grateful because we're cold. That's interoception. When we have sympathetic, parasympathetic stimuli coming into us, most patients come to us in a sympathetic overload. They usually have pain or some active fight or flight kind of thing going on. And for us to be successful in our therapy, what we want to do is calm them down and allow the sympathetic to drop and the parasympathetic to come up. But it's always a binary system. It's always in flow together. So in order to get the parasympathetic up, we've got to get the sympathetic to go down. We can do that by the tone of our voice, the soft music or the soft paint on our walls, by asking questions like, what brought you here today? What are your goals for therapy? And then they can recognize they're being listened to, they're being heard. In this particular study, it's a myofascial release study. Patients lay on a table. The therapist did a cross hands release for 15 minutes in the same position. And there was functional MRI measuring the excitability or the input that was coming into the insula. And if the insula relaxed more, that showed that the sympathetic was going down and the parasympathetic was going up. And therefore, the person receiving the treatment was more likely to, the hypothesis, respond in a positive way to the manual therapy. The therapist's role was simply to do the myofascial release and attend to what was happening under their hands, under his hands or her hands, and with the intention to help. The control group, same setup, cross hands release, but the therapist had earphones on. And in the earphones, there was a clanging, an intermittent clanging, not a regular clanging, intermittent. So the therapist could not pay attention to what was happening to this connection under his or her hands. And the interoceptive nervous system in functional MRI never relaxed. The patient was responding to the therapist's lack of intention or lack of attention to what was happening under their hands. So this is one of the ways that science is coming up with measuring what we say we think is happening by our observation and by what our patients tell us after they're finished with the treatment. So does this matter to John? No, he doesn't care, but it matters to me. It matters to John in a different way. It matters to me because I can say there's good beginning data to show that there is a resonance between the therapist and the patient that can be technologically measured through functional MRI response in the insula of the therapist to the patient. Another study measured whether the patient could pick up the heartbeat of the therapist during treatment. And it showed that the patient was picking up the heartbeat of the therapist during the manual therapy.
Wow. Okay. So one, that goes to show that the therapist's power is in their ability to stay grounded, centered, and
attention
present.
And intention. Channel 3, getting out of your left brain, dropping down,
Yes.
being and feeling what's going on between my hands, what's going on under my hands, opening up to intuition. What's the fascia telling me it needs in terms of compression and tension? Where will I go next? What's this system telling me about the impact of what I'm contributing here to the whole response?
Absolutely. And I find myself on a different chapter in my life. So there was once where I was very much someone, new grad out of PT. There's this huge push towards evidence-based practice and having the research be able to prove what you're doing. And yes, I think that serves a role. I'm not saying it's, worthless. We need to get rid of it. But I do feel like some of the things that we've been doing have been outdated. And so because we've built all these systems that follow this paradigm, someone like John needs to come along and say, hey, this is completely wrong. Now, he's been doing this for, decades, and he has shared that he's never had a problem with confidence. And so him being the renegade and standing up for the things that he believes comes more naturally to him, and I also firmly believe and follow the things that he teaches about. But I think where I resonate with your story is I still identify with being a physical therapist who's very into the science. And having something like this journal that you just shared gives evidence to what we're doing, even though John has already known for a long time that what he's been doing has been ultimately helping people beyond a level that regular medicine has been able to do. And I think that he's had his own injuries where he's been let down, which is why it's easier for him to step away. And I've had the same experience where I've had multiple knee surgeries and traditional medicine could not help me. It's not until I got exposed to something like the Gray Institute where they started challenging the status quo. And then now I'm, a myofascial release therapist adding to that. But for you to be able to share a journal article for someone in physical therapy who's like, I feel like there's something here.
Right.
But I know that I'll be judged by it because it doesn't meet the same standards as I went through school with, that it's harder for me to let go of this education that I just paid six figures to get a degree from. Whereas, ultimately, hopefully what we genuinely drive us to become physical therapists is to help others. I think your early research was, hey, how do I connect with somebody? That resonance that you're talking about. That was something that caught your attention early on, even before myofascial release.
Right.
And I think that has to be the ultimate driver under why we choose to go in this profession, because we're not doing it to get rich. Not saying that it's not possible, but generally people don't become physical therapists to get a lot of money. It is for that ability to serve others and help others. And I know a huge part of my fulfillment comes from being able to help patients do things that they didn't think that they could do, that I knew that they could do. And I had to just meet them where they're at and walk them along in that process. In doing so, I feel like I've developed, a compassion, because I don't want them to have to go through the same, multiple surgeries that I went through, and I carry that with me. Now, can we go back to your research about empathy? Can you define what empathy is, and then can empathy be taught?
Empathy, according to Edith Stein, and she wrote a dissertation in the 1930s, where she looked at empathy as a unique process, a human process that's given to us after the fact. It's absolutely unique. There's nothing else like it, but you can't do it because it happens to you. She said, for example, in empathy, it happens in 3 stages. First of all, this is, again, a phenomenological description of empathy as it occurs within people. And I did within physical therapists for their patients because I interviewed physical therapists. And I said, first of all, I went to physical therapy departments. When you're experiencing empathy, I looked for physical therapists who had good patient relationships. So I'd go into a department, I'd say, who are the PTs that have good rapport with their patients? And then I interviewed them. And I said, if sympathy is fellow feeling, that you and another person can feel aligned in your excitement about the fact that the Celtics won their game last night and they might be champions again. That's sympathy. We can be in sympathy. Or you can have sympathy for someone who feels bad, and you know what it's like to feel bad. You can have sympathy for your patients. There are a lot of textbooks who say empathy is bad because you'll lose your therapeutic objectivity. But sympathy is fellow feeling. Empathy is different. Some people say empathy is putting yourself in the place of another person, walking a mile in another person's shoes. That's self-transposal. So it's not sympathy, it's not self-transposal. Some people say in empathy, you totally lose yourself. You become so at one with the other person, you forget who you are. It's like being twins, only one person instead of 2, or finishing each other's sentences, or mirroring each other's thoughts. Though that's identification. And you can identify with people, and you can identify with causes. The MAGA movement in our country is an example of how people are really so identified with one philosophy and movement in the country that they dress a certain way, they come to rallies and so forth. That's identification. Projection is different in that there's stuff that you're feeling that you don't want to look at specifically, so you see it in everybody else and you point it out. But other people would say, it's interesting that person points that out in that person, but I see it in that person as well. Those are all related phenomena. Edith Stein said, no, empathy is this. First of all, there's a moment, and this is what I was looking for my physical therapist. I said, can you tell me about a time when you had not sympathy for a patient, but you actually felt yourself kind of like crossing over emotionally into the experience the patient was having and getting yourself back. That's what Edith Stein said empathy was. And they said, sure, I can tell you that. And one story was a woman was working with a young man with paraplegia, and she was working with him to get him ready to go home, and he was engaged to be married. And so it was a rehab center back in the day when we got a chance to work with them in rehab centers. And she was working with another patient on the mat, and he kind of rolled himself into the area. And she saw him in peripheral, and she said, David, I'll be right with you. Go ahead and transfer to the mat, and I'll be right with you. And she kept working with her patient, and she noticed that David was not transferring. So she finished up with her one patient. She went over, she knelt down, and she looked him in the eye, and she said, you didn't transfer. What's going on? And he said, I'm feeling really, really bad. And she wheeled him around to a private area. And she got down at his level, and she said, tell me what's going on. And he said, my fiance just told me that she and my brother have fallen in love and they're going to be married. And she said, Carol, in that moment, my heart sunk. And I was so emotionally entangled in that moment. I just couldn't get a sense of who this was, him and this was me. So she said, what I did was I reached out and I took his hand and kind of in a way of saying, wait, this is him. This is me. This is not my problem. This is his problem. Keep yourself separate here. And then she said, oh, David, I'm so sorry. I know how much you were looking forward to this new life with your fiance. And there are no words, really. So Edith Stein unpacks that with self-transposal, listening, putting yourself in the place of the other person, listening carefully, identification, if it's happening to me, then sympathy. No, it's not happening to me. This is you and this is me. Aligned. That package, which happens sometimes in 10 seconds, is empathy. And it happens to you. You get it after the fact. It's what's called non-primordially given. And it's sui generis. It's absolutely unique. And it's a composite of all three of those experiences. If that's true, if her hypothesis is true, and that is what makes empathy unique, and Martin Buber has written a lot about self-transposal and crossing over and getting yourself back energetically. Carl Rogers talks about the healing being between people, the energy between the people. There's some evidence in psychology and philosophy to indicate that these are experiences that have been looked at in a research and a scholarship kind of way. If you believe that's true, then you can't teach someone how to empathize. You can teach people how to block empathy simply by not paying attention and not getting involved. Put that boundary up. You can't teach people how to empathize. You can teach active listening. You can teach I statements. You can teach being present in the moment to what's happening, to the emergent properties of the systems that you're involved in with systems theory. You can teach sensitivity. You can teach a development of sensitivity. And I used to have my students journal about experiences and their feelings about those experiences. But you can't teach empathy in that sense.
That's a little disappointing for me to hear. And I don't know that I completely agree with that. I feel like I have learned empathy. I wasn't someone who was always in tune with my emotions. And I think as I've gotten deeper with myofascial release, understanding and feeling those emotions has helped me empathize with somebody else. But thank you for sharing the story that you did. I think it echoes a principle that John always teaches us, and that's never lead or force. I think the anecdote that you had shared was the therapist, asking her patient to transfer, and he didn't do that, and instead of being projecting, it's like, you're a bad patient, you're not doing this, those you statements that cause people to become defensive. She came at it with a curious heart of understanding. Hey, what's going on? Oh man, something's wrong. And then beyond that, it was the moment in which she pulled the patient to a separate corner where she was just there with him. I think a lot of times, especially us men, we try to fix things. We say, okay, well, you're feeling bad. Hey, let's do this. Let's do this.
Yeah.
But almost all the times when my patient or most patients are asking for help, they don't need you to do anything. They just want you to sit in the mud with them.
Right.
And once you are there sitting in the mud with them, not telling them what to do, not telling them what to feel, not leading and forcing, but just coming from a compassionate heart to say, hey, what's going on? Oh my gosh, I can't imagine how much that is hurtful.
I can't imagine. Never say, I know exactly how you feel.
Yes, never. And it's because you
Very
wouldn't.
few nevers, but that's one of them.
Yes. But it's just very much like, I understand how much you were looking forward to building that life, and so she's just meeting that person where they're at, being very present in that moment.
Channel 3, right?
Yes. And so for me, I was hoping that there was research saying, oh, and it can be learned, and
well, you can teach active listening. You can teach dropping down like John does. Go from channel 5, use your channel 5 diagnostic, put together. But when the moment comes when you're about ready to touch that patient, you drop down. And I love the Traeger response. And can you feel the air, the weight of the air on your limbs, on your body? Feel that now. Soft hands in soft clay. Feel that. And drop down and stay. What's happening under my hands? Feel for it. Listen carefully. Don't allow your mind to wander. With the intention of helping.
Yes.
And attending to what's happening in this system, this whole system that I'm impacting in this one small space.
You got it.
I'm really impacting with my whole bioenergetic field.
Beyond your human body, beyond all of that. Now, okay, my understanding of empathy comes from, like, you have to learn it from one stage to the next. The first stage is pity, and that's, I feel sorry for you. And then you had touched on the next stage, which is sympathy.
Yes, I left that one out. That's the worst part of empathy.
Yes.
Making a person less than you.
Which is a part of it, but again, I can't say that I feel that often, but it's a part of it. You're able to feel something outside of yourself.
Yeah.
Then moving to sympathy is, I feel for you, and the examples that you had listed. And then it goes to empathy, which is, I feel with you, right? That is, hey, I feel this with you. And you talked about the different, I guess, the 3 versions of that. And then ultimately that leads to compassion, which is, I am here to help. Do you feel like it follows that kind of trajectory, or are those separate things to you?
I believe that it follows that trajectory. I think it's an unfolding, an emergent property in systems responding to what's happening in the environment and inside yourself and outside yourself. And that's systems theory. Emergent properties is the ability, dynamic ability, to respond in the moment from within appropriately to bring about the goal of what you want. Yeah, but if you're overwhelmed with an ideology where you can only see one way of seeing things, you're not going to be working as an emergent, holistic, dynamic system. You're working as a robot, as an automaton. No, you're correct. Pay attention. Active listening. I statements, not you. I. This made me feel. I was wondering if that might be what you were feeling.
Yes. And that has been a journey for me, especially in the context of especially relationships where you get triggered with certain things, and being able to drop in and not let the chaos take over, but to step away from that, to empathize or sympathize with my partner or whomever you're speaking with.
Right.
Okay. That was so great. Can I ask you, you had this moment where you took MFR1, and then you knew that it was going to change your life if you continued down this path.
Yeah.
But you didn't take another course for 5 years because you felt the fear of judgment. Now, if you were talking to that version of yourself, right? Let's say you could meet the version of you right after taking MFR1. What would you tell yourself?
Well, this is a trade-off. I was at the time a director of curriculum, and we were going through an accreditation process with the Commission on Accreditation. And my leadership of a faculty to pull together the self-study and the whole process of accreditation was on my plate primarily. And I was responsible for the outcome of that process. And I felt as if I took the courses, I would get distracted dramatically because that's where my heart would be. And so what I would tell myself now is go ahead and take to an unwinding if you want, but recognize that when you're treating patients, not a lot might change. You'll see if a lot will change. And in my estimation now, a lot would change. But I wasn't treating patients at the time because I was having to do this other body of work. And then I joined the faculty practice after we got accreditation and began taking the courses. So it was a trade-off, and it happened, it presented itself as either or to me. Now I probably could say you could probably do both and. You're probably good enough to be able to do both and you ought not to be threatened. But when I made the commitment in 1995, I committed full bore. I changed my whole practice to myofascial release and exercise, totally. And from that moment on in 1995 until yesterday, I've been treating with myofascial release and exercise as a physical therapist.
And during this time, have you ever had the criticism that you feared from your peers in the science field?
Sure.
You have. And how would you recommend, let's say, someone new grad from PT school, they take a John course and they're like, oh, wow, physical therapy could be totally different. But I'm studying for my boards. I have to get this stuff down. What would you tell them?
Get the credential, make a space, and then come for the courses. And I've had several students come to me later in their careers and say, I'm so sorry I didn't do this sooner. The sooner you can get to it, the more your practice is going to be fulfilling, no matter what your certification is. You may have to say a party line in order to get a certification, but you could always open your curiosity and open your practice to these principles that will fulfill you in a much deeper way than board certification could ever offer you.
100%. I think I asked that question because that was me. I was like, I know that there's these different philosophies that are just blowing my mind, and I can see it in front of my eyes, how much it can help somebody. But I have to pass my exam so that I can get my license. And so you have to play the game, unfortunately. Yep. Now, John now teaches a bunch of massage therapists, but back in the day, I heard that there was tons of criticism. If you were talking with someone who was fearful of criticism because you worked through that, what would you guide them to do or say?
The way John guided me. How do you want to live your life? What big a price is it to pay when your friends don't sit with you at the table when you're at a fellows meeting? They go sit with their randomized trial friends. What big of a price of it is it to pay when you're not invited to give a talk to combined sections meeting, when you are an international expert on the topic of fascia and biotensegrity, but no one reaches out in physical therapy to say, will you come teach us what you're teaching manual and movement therapists around the world? Will you come teach us this? In response to an invitation. California PT Association invited me, and I gave the talk. And one of my graduates was there and said that she had taken John's course 10 years after she graduated, and she's so sorry she waited so long. But California was open, so that was a little bit of an opening there. But I've been turned down for the Mary McMillan twice, not once, twice. I have been shunned by fellows at fellows meetings, by the randomized trial group, and the journal won't publish my publications. The Journal of Manual and Movement Therapy does. The Journal of Bodywork and Movement Therapy publishes my stuff and my student stuff, but the Journal of Physical Therapy published the empathy study, but they wouldn't publish any other studies. They said the N wasn't large enough. They said I did a nice study on looking at the effects of myofascial release on a patient with rheumatoid arthritis. And she actually got off methotrexate through doing myofascial release.
That's
Um,
awesome.
yeah, and the quality of her life really improved. That's a Journal of Manual and Movement Therapy. Aaron Cusick is the first author on that. My students worked with it. I was their major professor, and we did it together, and they wrote it up. So that is also quoted quite a bit in ResearchGate. So there are other places that I've been able to be published, but not in the physical therapy, not in the Journal of Physical Therapy.
Gotcha. I think to sum that up, it's, you're not going to get the seat at the same table that you thought you would.
Right. So much worth it to know what I know, to be able to teach what I teach without reservation, and to be gratified for it, to get a certain amount of recognition for being knowledgeable, because I quote the science, like all
Yes.
physical therapists should.
So yes, you're not going to get those seats to the table, but seats will open for you at other tables that
Yes,
are beyond what you could comprehend in that moment. And I
exactly.
think whether it's symposium talks or the research, you play a very prominent role in the MFR community
Mhm.
because you are the olive branch to the medical community. I think when John kind of shuns them and like, this is the wrong paradigm, and he kind of stands very firmly against it. And while I agree with that, I also know that the more we can bring others together, that is when our unified message can spread more versus a me versus you mentality. And so I think you play a perfect role, and I want to thank you for continuing to do so. I think when I think of the future of healthcare and myofascial release being a very big part of that, it is introducing that in schools. And that is something that you've done at a very high level. So I just want to thank you for continuing your work and spreading along the message of myofascial release.
Well,
Now, before we wrap up, is there any last thing you would like to share with the audience?
well, I'd like to remind you that John has been asked to speak before physician groups, and he's been very effective in speaking in some physician groups. The orthopedists and the back surgeons and Steve Levin had him come speak. When he speaks to physician groups by invitation, he's very powerful, and his words are very powerfully received. So I don't want to give the impression that he's shunned by all physician groups. That's not true. Mostly what I would want to say is, when people keep saying, well, let's ask Carol Davis, where's the peer-reviewed article about this? You can look this up. You don't have to ask me. You can do this. You can go on Google Scholar and just type in the words that you're looking for and see what peer-reviewed articles come up. And you think, well, I don't want to read that. That stuff is so hard to read. Well, read the discussion and conclusions. Just get a journal article, read the discussion and conclusions, and then go back to the methods and see if in the methods, there are a lot of articles that say the effects of myofascial release on, and in doing the research review for the myofascial release chapter for John in this book, a lot of them were not doing Barnes myofascial release. And I make that very clear. Barnes myofascial release is very specific in its principles. It's always holistic. The patient is always in charge. It's always energy based. It's always principle of sustained soft touch with elongation. We used to call it stretch. We don't so much anymore. Shear. Those are words that tend back to biomechanics. But I want to encourage people to be more curious about the research and read it for themselves and see what they come up with. Not say, well, we'll ask Carol to interpret that for us. You have the capacity to do this yourself. I'm not complaining. I'm very glad to help whenever I can. But I'd like more people to engage there, be like a curious cat. See what you can find in the literature that supports what you're noticing with your patients, and then use that as your recommendation to your colleagues.
Yeah, we all have the power to look this stuff up. I think it's a little different because I know that for those of us who are PTs and we're taught how to look at research, and
Yeah.
like you said, the end value has to be a certain number. Whereas if you didn't grow up doing that, especially with kind of the medical jargon where it's like kind of dry, I can
Yeah.
see why people don't go that route. But the information is there, and you can only help those who want to help themselves. And I think if you really want to find those answers, that you should be the person who starts that journey. And then you're there to help. You're not there to do all the work, but it's like,
That's
I'm
good.
sure that
Yeah,
if I was like, oh, Carol, I had read this research and it went over here, what do you think?
good.
Then
I'd be
you would,
glad to do that.
yeah, you're glad to do that. But when you're just like a pseudo ask Siri, it's like, that's not what you're trying to do. And everyone has the ability to kind of look for those answers on their own. And
Yeah.
then, yes, I'm not saying that John hates the entire medical field. And I know that he has given very powerful talks, but I think a lot of the doctors are caught up in this system where the politics run the show. And to make
They don't even know
change,
what fascia is.
yes,
They have no concept of this system, this whole organizational system. They see it as connective tissue.
yes. I think a lot of the discrepancies with it is, John is teaching myofascial release as like an art, and there's a technique to it. And if I was going to teach a group of scientists how to paint and say, hey, this is a brush stroke, it's not about like, hey, you got to hold your elbow at 90 degrees and it's got to go at this velocity and this, it's
Yeah.
like, it's a little bit too objective and you take the artistry out of that, which is why I think that there's going to be this conflict. And something that you had written in your book that went along the energy medicines was, how do you research something that you cannot measure? That's such a great question. And that's the conundrum, that we know that we feel something, but we can't measure that. But it's a very real experience. Whereas the science and the research is, okay, how do we prove this? And then the less variables there are, the better, so that we can say, hey, this was caused by this one thing. But as we know, and as you've stated before, like in real life, you're a different person hour to hour, day to day. And so to measure you at a point in time and reference that point to say, hey, everybody else is going to be measured by this one point, is going to lead us in a direction that doesn't really give us the right answers or the right questions to ask.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said.
Perfect. Okay, so as we wrap up, can I just ask, how do people find you?
My email is cmdavis@miami.edu.
Perfect.
cmdavis@miami.edu. You can email me, or I'm on Facebook, and you can Facebook Messenger me. I get a lot of requests from Facebook Messenger, sending people to the right direction.
Perfect. And the last question
in
is,
this area, we do a myofascial release study group. And the next myofascial release study group is July in Maine. Look on Facebook on MFR Insight for the Southern Maine MFR study group. We'll be in York with Leslie Frazier, and we'll be studying from 10 to 1 on that Saturday. I think it's the second Saturday in July, or the third. And that's always fun, because it's just us working with each other and exploring principles. I don't do any teaching there. I guide. If they want me to teach, I will. I used to teach for John the courses. I was one of his MFR DVD faculty. But Lyme disease took that away from me. I wasn't able to travel in the same way and didn't have the energy to do it at the time. So I had to discontinue that. I miss it. I love watching the light bulb go off.
yes.
Especially with the PTs. I wasn't afraid of them at all.
Nice. Okay, last question is, who do you have in the Boston versus Dallas NBA Finals?
I have to say, I'm for Boston.
Go Celtics! Thanks for listening to another episode of Myofascial Health. I help myofascial release therapists create beautiful websites for their MFR practices, even if they aren't tech savvy. If you're just starting your MFR practice, or you're an experienced MFR practice owner, learn more about how I can help at www.myofascial.health/website.